Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Adams. I'm the president of Balancing Act. Several times a year, we like to highlight some terrific examples of budget engagements that our clients are doing. And today we have the opportunity to learn about what the city of Dubuque, Iowa has been doing. And we've got their finance and budget director, Jenny Larson, here to help us with that. I'll introduce her in just a moment, but I also want to start by just giving a little bit of context and background about some of the exciting things that are going on right now with regards to budget engagement and transparency. It's really, I think, an important time, and there's a lot going on, and we're very heartened by all the interest in this. As I mentioned, this is we're at a bit of a tipping point. There is a great deal of interest from researchers, from local governments, both in the U.S. and Canada, and really even around the world. And part of it, we're always reluctant, even though we are a technology company, we're always reluctant to say that technology is the be-all, end-all solution. But technology is actually making some things happen that hadn't been possible before. This is the Government Finance Review. I'm sure many of you recognize the cover of that, and this is from last year, 2018. And there's an article in it that was written by myself and a guy named Mark Mack. He's a senior consultant at GFOA. And it's just talking about, it talks about the history of budget simulations and budget engagement and what having the availability of sort of a highly configurable, inexpensive, accessible budget technology, cloud-based technology, how that creates some new possibilities. I think researchers have noted for a long time that simulations are the best way to educate and engage people on the budget, and the new technology makes that possible at a scale and at a price and at a level of accessibility like never before. And in addition to just budget engagement, it's also hitting upon sort of the next wave of transparency. If any of you were at the recently concluded annual conference of the Government Finance Officers Association in Los Angeles, you might have been at a session where they talked about the current work of the Transparency Task Force. I think it's got 13 local government budget and finance officers that are participating in this. And they have been doing quite a bit of work in transparency, but they're now starting to hone their recommendations a little bit more to try to take advantage of some of the new technology and the opportunity to have two-way engagement on the budget. So this is the cover graphic for the report. Right now it's out for comment. It's set to be adopted, I think, in September, but there is an opportunity for anyone who wants to read it and provide some comment over the summer to do so. I'm going to show you just a couple of the highlights of this. This graphic sort of illustrates kind of the status or the possibilities, and they've determined that education and education and informing are the two major goals that they have for online financial transparency. And like any of those quadrant graphs that we see all the time, you kind of want to be in this upper right-hand quadrant. And so they talk about having drillable, searchable data, having ways of understanding constraints. Specifically, budget simulations are a powerful way of doing this. Having timely data, accurate data, and providing a lot of context. That's one of the things I think by putting budget trade-offs into the context of a simulation where you can see how expenditures in one area affects another area, how spending items affect revenue, that context and showing some of those constraints that you all have in the real world can be really critical. This is the recommendations page, the top four. And as you can see, they're calling for interactive platforms that leverage simulations, two-way communication, place a premium on participation. So it's not just showing people information, but really trying to have people interact with it in a way that's realistic. They talk about using in-person channels. And one of the reasons why I was excited to have Jenny from Dubuque share her story is that they've done some really good work with using Balancing Act in in-person settings. I think they had a meeting that had as many as 200 people in it, which is just, for me, very exciting. Context and that drillable, the opportunity to drill down and get additional information. Once again, Jenny has done some really great work with that. Many of her info icons that she's used to sort of explain a budget item or a trade-off actually contains some really great information, including some photos in some areas. And then this last point is just talking about simulations and feedback mechanisms, being able to, the recommendation calls for controlling the options. The way that we think about it, because citizens often don't like to be controlled, or feel as though they're being controlled, we think about it in terms of providing constraints. So if you're in a state that, for example, can't increase taxes without a vote of the people, we provide you a way to illustrate that in your simulation. Or if there are certain funds that can only be used for certain spending items, we provide you a way to link those two together. And then before I turn it over to Jenny, I just want to note that a part of what makes me think that we're at this tipping point where two-way interactive communication, including simulations, is really going to become the norm, is that we've had this wonderful group of researchers that have come together to largely around the Association for Budgeting and Financial Management, ABFM. It's a professional organization, but they've really started to take an interest in what's possible. As I said, this tipping point, and to sort of come together and help to create what they're now calling the Balancing Act Research and Education Consortium. We've got 25 researchers from 15 universities. We've got representatives from GFOA and National League of Cities there. They've gone out and sought a grant to create a special teacher account so that teachers across the country can use Balancing Act in their classroom to sort of teach budgeting, to provide sort of kind of an inside access to some of the larger simulations we have, like the one for the United States government. It's very exciting. And then we've also got a track where we're looking at building out some research options for them so that they can sort of learn more about how simulations work, what their impact are, and also to get a better understanding of what do you do with the input that residents provide you when they go through simulations. How do you use that? There's a term that I don't know if it's too well understood outside of academia, but it's one that I think is important. It's called revealed preferences. And that means that it's sort of, asking people to sort of, in a sort of a natural context, to say, what is it that we're really interested in, and to kind of test that willingness to pay or that willingness to cut in terms of the trade-offs between various spending items and also spending items and revenue. So we're very excited with that. And then we also are working with some local governments that have wanted to have some additional scientific validity to the results that they're seeing on Balancing Act, so that we can sort of say a little bit more with a little bit more confidence that if a certain number of residents, for example, were supportive of a certain option, that what that means and were those folks representative. So it's just this wide open, fun, exciting time, and we really welcome having all these folks participate with us and help us to really see what we can do in terms of finding a nice way to connect residents and their government, especially on these tough financial issues. And so to give a real world example of that, I'm really pleased to introduce Jenny Larson. She can say a little bit more about herself, but she's Director of Finance and Budget at the City of Dubuque. And I first met her a couple of years ago at the Government Finance Officers Association in St. Louis. She was giving a big presentation to a packed house of people. And they had done just some wonderful work in terms of budget engagement, that you could just tell how important it was as a value both to her and also to the city government overall. And they just have a great story, and we're just very pleased to have her. So Jenny, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to give you control, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay, thanks, Chris. This is Jenny Larson. As Chris said, I work for the City of Dubuque, Iowa, and I have been with the city for 13 years. Initially, I was the budget director, but in March, the city manager actually combined our budget and finance department. So then I took on a new role of being director of finance and budget. So working through some of the issues of consolidating departments, but it's been very exciting. And I look forward to continuing engaging on both actually finance and budget. So I just want to start out where we started on our path. Our city council actually has an annual goal setting process before we kick off our budget process. So in August of 2014, our city council actually set the goal of financially responsible, high-performance city organization. So that goal included easy, convenient access to city information and services, opportunities to become involved in city governance and planning. And so it was on the staff to implement what that looked like as far as financial transparency tools and take steps to improve community engagement. Our city council did not feel we were engaging enough people in our budget and other processes, so that is where this all started. So after that goal was set, we looked at launching a couple of online tools. The first one was launched in fiscal year 2016. That was the Socata Open Budget Platform. So that's a tool where residents can explore and interact with our operating and capital budgets. They can look at how we're doing with actual spending and revenues versus budgeted, and they can drill down to the various programs. And then the following year, we launched the Socata Open Checkbook Platform. So again, it's another interactive tool on our website, and residents can actually drill down all the way to the payments to the vendors if they're interested in how the city of Dubuque is spending their money. So those were the first two items launched. And then the next step we had to look at was how are we going to change our community engagement. So we started with our budget process. And our old process was we had one public input meeting with the city manager. It was typically held the week of Thanksgiving, not necessarily at a great time, so maybe the Tuesday before Thanksgiving at 5:30 p.m. And there weren't a lot of people who turned out for that. And then we did 6 public input meetings with the city council where departments were presenting their budgets and the public could also give comments. And then we had the required public hearing to adopt the budget. So we had low resident participation, typically less than 20 residents engaged annually, so not great results. So we decided, well, we need to find out what we're doing wrong and how we can come up with a plan to improve this. So we surveyed neighborhood groups across the city in 2016, and what we found out was we essentially needed to go where the people were. In the past, we basically would be at a city location and ask residents to come to us, like at the library or a rec center, and we wouldn't get anyone that showed up. So the residents said, request to be added to agendas of active community groups. So we took their advice and we started making those changes. So we implemented a new input process in our fiscal year 2017 budget. So we were added on to the agendas for the neighborhood groups that were active. And then we also changed the public input meeting with the city manager. We felt that meeting was still important, but we made it earlier. So we actually met in October, and we actually changed the time to give people an opportunity to get home from work, maybe eat first, and then come to the meeting. So we had increased participation there. We also created an online budget input form for any residents that could not attend meetings or just preferred to give online input. And then we had kiosks. They were actually paper kiosks. So it was a questionnaire that residents could fill out and then put in various kiosks across the city to submit their budget input. And then we did a lot of social media marketing of our input sessions. So we did increase our participation. We had 115 residents provide input, and then staff had to respond to about 245 of their comments. So improved engagement, but still very manual and staff dependent as far as processing that data. So the limitations of our prior budget engagement process was, like I said, it was a manual process. We were capturing most of the resident input using easel pads during the meetings. There was significant staff time summarizing all the data, and also staff time in preparing all the handouts that we were using for the meetings. And so residents were receiving limited information based off of those handouts and the presentations that staff gave. And then we also weren't reaching all the populations of the community. So we were only getting certain demographics, a lot of people age 50 and over, not much of the young population of the city or other demographics. So in 2018, as Chris mentioned, I attended the GFOA conference in St. Louis, and then I also presented on community engagement. And then after my presentation, Chris approached me and he told me about the Balancing Act interactive budget simulation tool. And I was very excited to hear about it because of the time it was taking to do engagement. I was interested in seeing the tool and seeing how much easier it would be to be able to do the engagement and collect the data and make it a more interesting process for people. So I learned it was easy to use. It has a meeting mode that can be used in our targeted engagements. It also has a taxpayer receipt tool, and it has all the built-in data analytics where we don't have to manually collect all that data. So in May of 2018, we actually did a demo of the Balancing Act tool, and then by July, we had implemented Balancing Act. So we had gone through and set up all of our programs and did additional information and more details and added pictures. And we had it basically ready to go in July. And so we had set some engagement goals actually every time that we do community engagement. So we wanted to educate residents on the city's budget. We wanted to engage people in a more interactive way. And we also needed input on specific issues. And then we wanted to allow residents to submit their own balanced budget based on their priorities. And then we wanted to use the tool in presentations across the city. So we started out with targeted engagements using the tool. The first one that we actually did was at an event called City Expo. So that's a huge event at our Five Flags Convention Center. And every city department sets up a booth and they provide information to residents, and they may have giveaways that draw people in. So what we did in the budget department was we had about 3 staff members available with iPads, and as residents would come through, we would ask them to answer the 3 scenario questions that we had built into our Balancing Act tool. And if they answered the questions, they would get candy, and then they'd also be put in for a chance to win a prize. So that was the first time that we used the Balancing Act tool, and it was pretty fun to actually be able to engage the residents at City Expo, because normally it was just having handouts available and not as much interaction. So that was a very highly interactive event. And then the next big event, which these photos are actually from on this slide, was we were able to be put on the agenda of the Young Professionals Group, which is a group of 40 and under people in the city of Dubuque, and they have a fairly large membership, over 200 people. So at this luncheon, there was about 200 people there. So we presented the tool and basically gave a short presentation on how to use it, and then we let everyone in the audience try to balance their own budget. And then we had staff members that circulated around table to table to answer questions and help them use the tool. And then they submitted their budgets during that time and asked any questions that they might have. So it was a very exciting event, very engaging, very interactive, and we got a lot of great data from a demographic that we had not been able to reach up to this point. So this tool helped us be able to get on the agenda in order to be able to do this. So the results from using Balancing Act, we've used it just in our last budget process. So we actually presented in 14 different presentations. And in Dubuque, Iowa, we actually have 3 private colleges. So once they started finding out about it, they started making requests to have budget staff come into their classrooms and do presentations on the tool and get their students using it. We also found that we were able to do new engagement types. So we did a library workshop on using Balancing Act at our library. And as I previously spoke about, we also had an interactive experience at our City Expo. We reached a more diverse demographic, so we were reaching people that we had never been able to reach before. Our presentations were exciting and fun. And then, as I said before, the input was automatically collected by the analytics tool, which is great. And then it significantly reduced our staff time in preparation and also wrap up after all of our engagements. So in the analytics tool, we were able to see that we had, at the time that our budget was went to council, and during that time frame, we had a little over 1,300 page views. We had 163 submitted budgets. We had 20 people submit comments. All of the data from our scenario questions were captured, which that data will actually be going to our city council goal setting in July. And then we have all the demographics captured, like new versus returning users, age, gender, zip code. And then it also captures all the changes in revenue and expense that residents are doing as they're submitting their budgets. So our future plans and using the tool is we are going to use the data at our city council goal setting just to give city council an idea of what residents want in their budget. We had done 3 scenario questions. As we were going through it in presentations, it seemed like it might be a little too much, so we think we might limit the questions to just 1 or 2. And then we do have some revenues and expenses are locked, so we will be reevaluating which ones we should be locking and maybe unlocking. And then reviewing our program titles to revise to more simple terms. Sometimes people had difficulty understanding where to find things, so we just want to revisit that and see if we can make it a little easier. We're actually looking to start our budget presentations earlier because of this tool. It's much easier to do, so we're looking at doing that in August. And then we'd like to market to new community groups. So we actually had the software translated to Marshallese because we have a fairly large population in Dubuque, so we plan on targeting that group during this budget cycle and then hoping to target some other groups that have not been engaged in the past. So just some closing thoughts on the process as we went through it. We found that we did not have a one-size-fits-all solution for engagement in the community. We found we need multiple tools to achieve different goals. And even with online tools, we really needed to do targeted engagement to make everything, all different populations be engaged. We also needed to educate internal staff on the engagement tools. So I actually did demos and a bunch of different staff meetings across the city so that everyone was aware this tool existed. And management support from the beginning was important. So our city council kicked things off. The city manager supported the purchase of the software and implementation and the use in the community. And the need to go to the people, so leverage groups routinely meeting in the community, and then continue to evaluate and improve the process each year. So I'm actually going to jump to our website where we actually have our Balancing Act links. So this is the City of Dubuque website, and the landing page for budget is actually this page where it takes you right to the Balancing Act budget simulation. So you can see on this page that we actually created a it's two-sided, one-page help sheet for users to use both the budget simulation and the Taxpayer Receipt tool. So sometimes when people are using it on their own, it's just kind of nice to have a step-by-step tutorial to be able to use the tool. We do have it in both English and Spanish. And then if you just scroll down a little farther, you can see that we also have Taxpayer Receipt there as well, again in English and Spanish. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on our simulation. So I'll bring it into what we had for our fiscal year 2020 budget simulation. And when we set this up, we used our adopted fiscal year 2019 budget. So then we knew everything was in balance. And then we added in 3 scenario questions. So it has an easy to read chart to see where most of our money is going, in this case, capital projects. And then down here is the section on revenues. And then we have our spending categories, which these are what we are looking at reviewing to make sure they're simple enough for everyone to understand. And then when you expand each category, for example, agriculture and recreation is one of our scenario questions. So we were looking at needing to renovate our Five Flags Civic Center, and there are multiple options that we are looking at. So this allows a resident to choose what option they think is best for the community. And then in another category, we actually, let me see here, another scenario question, we provided under the information icon more details. We provided more information about what they were choosing. So in this case, it's the expansion of riverfront docking facilities. So it actually provides photos of what that would look like and where it would be located on our riverfront. So we spent a lot of time building out the more information, more detail. We were very interested in using Balancing Act as an education tool, so it allows residents to learn as much as they want about the city's budget. And then under revenues, we did lock some of our revenues because we do not have the ability to increase those. For example, local option sales tax, we're restricted to 1%, so we can't raise that to fund other things. Same with utility franchise tax, we're at the maximum 5%. So we locked a lot of those revenues that in reality we cannot increase to fund other projects. And I'll just jump to the taxpayer receipt here. So in the taxpayer receipt, it asks a few questions to determine how much sales tax is spent within the city, and then also property taxes. So it looks up tables as far as spending habits for an annual income and an age. So I will just insert some samples here. And then it asks what percentage are you buying goods and products within the city. And then if you own your own home, it will then ask what your taxable value of your residence is. And you can hit the eye icon and and if you click on the link, it will actually take you to the assessor's website where you can look up the taxable value of your home. So I'll just type in an amount there. And then it actually generates a receipt based on the taxable value of the resident's home, and it breaks it down by the category set up and all the way down to the department. So then residents can actually see, how much goes to public safety, broken down by police, fire, all the way down to, for example, general government. So it becomes clear that more money is spent on public safety and not general government. And then it gives a total taxes paid, which you can also click, and then it breaks down between sales tax and property tax. So it's a pretty cool tool. We actually used it to generate what the average homeowner pays in the city of Dubuque, and we used it in our budget documents. And it was very popular when we did targeted engagements. People were very interested to run their receipts. Does anyone have any questions at this point?
People have been texting some questions in. I do want to just note to anybody that if you want on your little control panel, there should be a place where you can ask a question. I think you raise a hand, and then I can see that on our panel, and I'll unmute you so that you can ask Jenny. But there are a couple of questions, Jenny. Let me ask you. So the first one is from Teresa, and forgive me if I've got your name wrong, but Teresa Rothschafer. And she is from Johnston City, Iowa. And she asks, did citizens want more input, or was it just the council assuming they did? And then she notes, we never have anyone show up at our meetings or public hearings.
I I would answer that question saying it was both. So our city council members were hearing from citizens that were contacting them that they weren't aware that there were opportunities for them to give input. So I think there were many weaknesses in our process as far as getting the word out that these engagement sessions were happening on our budget, and also making them in an environment where people feel comfortable going. So the 6 meetings that we have with city council are in a very formal city council room where a resident would have to go to a podium to address the council, which is, very nerve-wracking to most people. So we did not have good turnout in that scenario. So by going to community groups, people are more in their environment and we're taken out of ours, and they feel more comfortable giving the input, especially using this tool where they can visually see things. So I would say it was a request on both sides, and we especially found that out in the beginning when we went and surveyed the community to find out why people weren't participating. Most of the results were people didn't know they could participate, when they could participate, or they just felt that it was too overwhelming to participate in the way it was set up at that time.
Mm-hmm. No, and I'll just add a little bit more too, because I talk to finance directors and budget directors all the time across the country, and some of them, do sort of say, well, gosh, people don't come to our budget hearings, or it just doesn't seem like the public has an interest in this, and I think that's one way to interpret that. But what we found is that residents who want to get involved, they often don't know how. The budget is a pretty intimidating thing. I mean, one, it has numbers and math, and that can be intimidating to a lot of people. Also, there's just the tools and the entry points to even understand the budget it's complicated. And as you know, I mean, most of the people on this call are budget professionals, and this is your job, and you have analysts that help you probably, and it's a hard thing to understand. And I remember when my colleague Brenda Morrison and I, when we first started looking at doing budget simulations for cities, we first did one for the state of Colorado. We downloaded the budget for the city of Denver, where we live. And this was 2011, 2012, something like that. And even on a fast internet connection then, it took like 90 seconds to download a 2,200-page budget book. And, it was just intimidating. And it's in some ways, it's kind of no wonder why budget directors and finance directors might conclude, the public doesn't have an interest in this. What we think is that they don't have a way to get engaged. And that's what a lot of researchers are finding, is that simulations are the best way to do that. And now that you've got these cloud-based simulations that can be fairly easily created and also accessed by a lot of people, it's really kind of changing the game, we think. And please join in if you want. There have been a few more questions. And Teresa, if you want to ask a follow-up, I'm glad to unmute anybody if you want, but there are a number of questions that have been put into the queue. And Jenny, if you want to comment further, you can. But we have a question from Zachary Wolf, who I believe is the finance director in Marion, Iowa. And he asks, how has using Balancing the Act influenced how the city of Dubuque approaches citizen engagement beyond budget development? Good question.
So we've only used it one season at this point. So through one budget process, we could potentially look at it for using it for other things. Unfortunately, we had already been in progress for doing engagement on our comprehensive plan for the city of Dubuque. So we did not use it for that, but it's definitely something that we will be looking at for other engagement opportunities in the city.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our company, the full name is called Engage Public, and we've been doing public engagement for more than 20 years now. And most of the time, more often than not, we would, when we work with a public entity, we'd be working with the communications function. A few cities and counties actually have a community engagement manager or coordinator, but that was kind of the natural entry point. And what technology has done for kind of that perspective on public engagement in local governments is things like discussion boards, or here's an idea, what do you all think about it? and here's some information and context. And there's a number of software programs that do that and do that very well. But where those don't do very well is with the budget. The budget is just sort of a different animal. And as I've said before, simulations, I think, are just by far the best way for people, if they're willing to give you 10 or 12 minutes of their time to provide you input. It's just a much more coherent way to do it, whether or not it's 10 or 12 minutes online, or if they're willing to come to a meeting. I mean, the meetings like Jenny described, the biggest complaints I've heard from those meetings, and I've done them that are, an hour or more long, is that they wanted more time because they were so engaged in doing it. And so, Zach, to answer your question, I think that the two are sort of hand in glove. But budget engagement is a different animal than just general community engagement and public involvement. And I think it takes some special tools because it's a little bit more technical in some ways. And to have finance directors like Jenny and like some others, Suzanne Slack is the CFO of Syracuse City School District, I think she's on, who are just thinking about this in a different way and not interpreting what seems to be people's lack of interest as genuine lack of interest, and more seeing it as a challenge and trying to find a way to reach out to folks. And comment anytime you want to add to what I'm saying, Jenny, please feel free. Another question from Sarah Moss, who I think used to work for the city of Denver in communications, and she might have some thoughts on this too. Sarah, if you want to be unmuted, just let me know. She asks, what marketing ideas does your team have that you haven't yet tried? And I'll just put a little bit of context on that. We talk to, as I said, we typically, I'm going to say 2/3 of the time we work with somebody who's in Jenny's position. But some of our very most successful implementations have been where there's sort of a collaboration between the PIO or the communications function and the budget folks. And I would like to see more of that. And Jenny, you've had phenomenal success with, I think you said 1,300 users. But one of the questions is, and I think behind Sarah's question is, have you involved your communications team, or have you found other ways of marketing, and what do you think the potential is there?
Sure. So we do involve our public information office here at the City of Dubuque. So when we used Balancing Act for the first time this last budget season, we did a variety of things. They helped us create our one-page, two-sided tip sheet. We also shot a video through our cable TV section, which is also part of our public information office. So they basically videoed me using the tool and explaining how to use the tool to the viewer who watched that show. So we tried to think of ways to get the word out that this tool was available and how to use it. Our public information officer also did a lot of social media outreach on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn, and about our various events that we were doing and about the tool itself when we launched it. So we'll be continuing to try to get the word out about the tool and educate people how to use the tool. Just some other thoughts that we've had is we do have a public transit bus system here. So we've kind of kicked around the thought about, putting up flyers on the bus about the tool, and, that people can pull it up on their smartphones. But we'll be discussing that more in the next couple of months.
Yeah. And the one thing that we've seen that can also really move the needle, so all those great, typical kind of communications marketing tools, they're fantastic, and I'm glad that you've had such a good response. One thing that we found that really works is getting elected officials involved. Having the mayor tweet about it or put it on Facebook, or having council members communicate with constituents. And there's this study that was done based on ICMA data from about 6 or 7 years ago. And what it found was that city managers and budget officers generally think that doing budget engagement, citizen engagement on the budget is a good and positive thing, but they actually saw it as something that needs to be led by elected officials. And elected officials, unfortunately, don't really have the tools and the information to actually do it. And so once again, to the degree that there can be sort of some collaboration among different functions and even different types of personnel, elected versus professional staff in a city, I think that's all sort of bodes well. But typically we have typically the simulation, because it requires some data, it's usually done by the Budget Finance Office, but we have a few very good implementations where it's actually been led by communications. So I think it really is, at the professional staff level, it's definitely somewhere between the finance office and the communications office. But in terms of once the tool is made, I found that the elected officials can really kind of move the needle in terms of participation.
One thing I would add, talking about elected officials, when our city council found out that we had this tool, they did request that I present it at we broadcast our city council meetings on the web and through our local TV channel here. So they requested that I actually present it at a city council meeting for the public and the council to use. So I did do that after launch as well. So then they became aware of how to use the tool, and then they also helped market it to any residents that may have contacted them.
That's terrific. All right, I think we've got one more question, at least that's been entered in the questions panel. So if anybody else wants to ask one, go ahead. But this last one is also from Teresa Rockshafer from City of Johnston, Iowa. And she asks, how did all that information get to the program? And she says, does the staff have to re-enter all the budget data, or does your software transfer? We have a small staff, and this looks great, but a lot of work.
So we use Excel to get it into Balancing Act, kind of like a copy pasting process. So getting the actual numbers in didn't take that much time. We spent a lot of time putting a lot of additional details in, but you know, if you have limited staff and limited time, you could just make that less detail as far as what citizens are seeing in order to be able to use this tool.
Yeah, and that's kind of been what we found too, is that you can get a kind of a basic simulation that has the basic numbers and basic information up really quickly, and it's a pretty easy import from Excel. But then a lot of the time, if you really want to put a lot of information like those photos, it doesn't take long to put the photos in, but you have to get the photos or those descriptions. It's really pretty easy to do, but to build those out can take a little bit longer. And the scenario questions that Jenny was showing, you know, like the one about the Civic Center, those take a little bit longer to create as well, because you're developing these different options. So usually we find that there's sort of a happy medium in terms of complexity and build out for you know, the particular local government. Now the good news is, and I think this is implied in your question, is do you have to re-enter it? So the first time you set up, you can pull it in from Excel. But then you can also, like next year, if Jenny wants, she can duplicate this year's, and she can update it and make some changes, delete a couple things and add a few more things. So it becomes easier as you go year over year. Okay, there's a new question from Christy Thomas. And I think Christy is from the city of, from city of Riverside, California. And I just met one of your staff not too long ago, Christy. She asked, did responses received through Balancing Act result in adjustments to the proposed budget or overall funding strategy, i.e. in terms of funding levels to specific programs or services? What was the impact, Jenny?
We did have a few changes based on submittals. A lot of them are in our parks and recreation area. We've suddenly had an increase in pickleball players, so there was a lot of input about that, and reviewing, you know, their existing budgets, what we had planned to budget, for example, for tennis court improvements and some other park improvements. We instead budgeted for more pickleball courts. So that's one example where we actually changed our budget. And then as far as the scenario questions go, those were asked with the intent that the information goes to the city council goal setting. So there will potentially be something that comes out of the goal setting due to the data that was submitted through Balancing Act.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, another thing that we found is that residents get that they are not becoming the finance director, or they're not becoming the city council member that's actually the decision maker on it. But what we've seen happen, because we've talked to people that have gone through the simulation, and they spend 10 or 12 minutes sort of learning about this. And the first thing that we hear from residents is, well, I'll tell you what it's not. They don't say, I didn't get what I wanted. The council didn't do what I said they should do. What we hear overwhelmingly from people that have gone through the simulation is, this is hard. And then they say, and I get why some of my priorities aren't necessarily the appropriate priorities of the city. And so, people understand. They look at these tough trade-offs, and they actually become fairly empathetic with the decision makers, with budget directors and other city managers and council members, because they realize it's really hard. But they can also see that their priorities, say that somebody's number one priority is dog parks. That may not necessarily be the best use and stewardship of taxpayer dollars. And so they certainly get to have their opinion, but they also need to take into account that your job is to make best use of tax resources for the entire city, and that they may or may not get just what they want. But at least what we found is that they feel more satisfied about the transparency of the decision. Or there's a scholar at Syracuse University who talks about this being a way to legitimize their participation, so that the budget isn't just happening over their heads. They actually see why things are the way they are, and with the context and the trade-off, and they get it. And so that to me is one of the most valuable things. It's not that your residents are all going to get what they want, but they begin to sort of pull back and take more of the larger view that you have to take, and they understand that there's going to be some things that they get that they want, and some things that they get that they don't. All right, anything else? We're getting towards the end of our time. Jenny, do you have any closing thoughts?
I guess my closing thoughts is, as we went through trying to improve our community engagement on budget, the Balancing Act tool was very helpful. It just gave us a new way to reach residents, some of which we would not have reached before. So it's been easy to use and great to work with, and seeing the data is very easy as well. So I have nothing but positives in using Balancing Act.
Oh, well, thanks, Jenny. We'd say the same thing about working with Dubuque. And I didn't realize when I added those slides at the beginning, I didn't realize really how closely you are already fulfilling what those recommendations say. So it's perfect timing. The recommendations coming out in draft form 3 weeks ago, and then having this presentation. You're doing some great work, Jenny, in Dubuque, and thank you for sharing your experience with us and with all your colleagues around the country. So, and thanks everyone for participating. If anybody, two quick questions. One I need to ask you, Jenny. They asked two or three people have asked if you would make your presentation available to people. So is that something that I could send out?
Yes. Yep. I'll send you the most current version. Yep.
All right. If you send it to me, I will distribute it to people. And then I also love your YouTube video. So if you don't mind, I'll get that link. I'll send it out to people as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I think that's it. Thank you all for your participation, and look for a follow-up email that has the items that I just talked about. So thanks everybody. Take care. Have a good rest of your day.